Vivian J. Lamb lecture series on Augustinian thought and the sciences. Normally offers one lecture every semester. It's a nice way to try to pull together the colleges of arts and sciences, or I should say the College of Arts and Sciences, into one, and to try to make sure that the riches that we have on campus don't get kind of isolated one from another. So in this series on the Augustinian tradition and sciences, thanks to the work of Dr. Lowell Gustafson, we have the possibility of hearing Archbishop Puhalo on the topic that you've seen the title of it, but I'm going to let Lowell do the introduction of the person. So my role is really ceremonial. I just get to introduce, to welcome, and to hand over everything to you.
Thank you, Father. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce it. Can you hear us okay? Lab, is this all right? I'm not sure you can hear us. Okay. That's not a good thing. Can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay. Anyway, I am delighted to introduce to you His Eminence, the Most Reverend Lazar Puhalo. He is from Canada. He's the abbot of the Monastery of All Saints of North America. So he is right now on the west coast of Canada, speaking to us. And as Father Fitzgerald mentioned, he can see the people who are in the inside. Oh, no, okay, now he can see those. And then there are folks off to the side here. So I can move the camera around, but if I tried to do that, I would screw it up. So I'm not going to try to do that. In any case, it's a delight to have him here virtually. He is the author of a number of books and has been interested on the relationship between religion and science for many years. His books include The Evidence of Things Not Seen, Orthodoxy and Modern Physics, and The Neurobiology of Sin, along with a number of other titles. He's going to speak to us today about his views on this, and so we're going to ask him to speak a little bit, and then afterwards, of course, he agrees to take some questions and comments, which he will be able to hear because of microphones throughout the room. So even if he can't see you, he'll be able to hear you at the end. And of course, we can hear you perfectly fine. So let me move this camera. Oh, yeah, you got it. Okay. Okay, and thank you for joining us.
Oh, yes. Well, I'm retired Archbishop, actually. I'm not Archbishop of Canada now. And also, I don't want to disappoint any students, but I'm also not a recruiter for Hogwarts. But you know, with my black robe and my beard, some people hope. I was going to say something about the models of reality as sources of conflict, because so often between science and religion, and between people in general, tribes and nations, our models of reality are what cause a great deal of the conflict. And when we talk about models of reality, you have to realize that we live in a model-driven world. I think it was Werner Heisenberg who said that in quantum mechanics, we've passed beyond the capacity of ordinary language to express realities, and we have to resort to mathematical formalisms. And in a way, the mathematical formalisms are metaphors for things that are not describable adequately in human language. At the same time, St. Gregory of Nyssa, one of the great Orthodox Church Fathers, said that when we speak of the Holy Trinity, we're not really speaking of something concrete. We're only using the best words available in human languages to describe a relationship. But generally, we, I think, fall in what Whitehead called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness in our ideas and our models of reality. Perhaps the most famous clash of models of reality was between, well, Copernicus, I suppose, but really Galileo and the Aristotelian model of reality about the universe. You know, Copernicus came up with the theory, but when Galileo pointed his simple telescope at the heavens, he demonstrated that the theory was correct. And he gave us another model of reality, which we've passed well beyond. You know, by the 5th century, Anaxagoras already realized that the Earth rotated on its axis and revolved around the sun. I think Aristarchus said the same thing already by the 2nd century. So it wasn't completely unknown, but the model of reality that was formed because Aristotle was considered almost a pre-Christian Christian thinker. And so his thought really won out. We also have to realize that we live in what we would call a reality tunnel. Now, the reality tunnel is really the scope of what we can know, limited by the instruments with which we have to look. And sometimes those instruments are ideas and not telescopes. So we've come into this model-driven reality thinking that we have concrete realities, or thinking that our models are concrete realities. If, for example, we look at, say, the creation narrative in Genesis, we understand, at least most educated people, understand that what we have here is a very simple narrative that's about meaning and not a concrete description about the creation of the universe. Yet we have many, many people who are more fundamentally oriented, who believe that this is a very literal description of the creation of the universe. And, you know, it doesn't mention deuterium even once. So we know that it isn't. And we have to remind ourselves that it was necessary for Moses to come down from the Mount of Sinai with the 10 Commandments. It would not have been terribly useful had he come down with a periodic table of the elements. So, you see, we're confusing something that's really about meaning with something that is supposedly scientific. And since many people have formed this into their ultimate model of reality, they're very distressed and disturbed, and even their faith is even shaken when modern science comes along and says, well, no, this isn't reality at all. I would venture to say, though, that the creation narrative, which tells us that the real issue with mankind is that we fell from an atmosphere of unselfish love into egotism, self-centeredness, and self, has a great deal to say to humanity and to all of the tragedies that we've developed ourselves in humanity. So it has very profound implications for the meaning of human existence and the problems of humanity, but says very little about the actual creation, which wouldn't have been terribly useful to describe the creation and the coming into being of the universe to a group of wandering semi-literate or illiterate people in the desert. So we had to have a revelation that was about meaning. Now, one accepts that as revelation or not is up to one. But what science has given us is an expansion on a constant expansion on our knowledge and understanding. And we realize that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, give or take a million, and that the origins of humanity are quite different. And yet at the same time, on the other side, we cannot claim it scientific. But it appears that those things which have survived over the millions and billions of years have had an innate capacity for evolution. In other words, that evolution isn't necessarily so haphazard and accidental as it appears. So we have a little bit of tension between a strictly scientific explanation and discussion and the models of reality which we defend sometimes by looking at some aspects of science. And when we are defending models of reality, really we can't say that it's scientific. We have to say that we're defending something that has become an ideology for us. Now, how this idea of, Nikolai Berdyaev, who certainly wasn't a theologian, but he was a great existentialist philosopher in Russia, he does mention that when faith collapses into religion, and then religion collapses into ideology, we have some really serious problems. Because the ideology itself is the basis upon which most wars are fought, most of the strife in our world unfolds. And religion certainly has played very deeply into that strife and that warfare. So we see that if we understand that we're presenting our models of reality, and science certainly understands, I mean, any good physicist will tell you they're presenting a model of reality and not reality itself. And we should also tell them we're presenting models about meaning from a religious point of view. Sometimes those models about meaning, however, clash so much that we worry about sometimes Islamic terrorism attacking us. The Shiites have the same problem, the Shiite Muslims, particularly in Pakistan. So the clash between Christian religions, for example, the 30 Years' War, which killed a bigger percentage of Europeans in this First World War. It killed 40% of the population of Europe. The 30 Years' War was strictly about religion, about doctrine, and it was fought between Christian religious groups. The same thing between the Alawites, the Shiites, the Sunni, and the Muslims. So we can see that this permeates a great deal of the problem that we have when every religious group thinks that their models of reality are actually absolute and concrete statements of reality and don't realize that they're models. Most of the conflict between science and religion is models of reality. But also conflicts between nations are based on models of reality, which actually ultimately are not reality. And when you have simple uneducated groups, say North Korea, or a situation in Iran, where models of reality have been taken as absolutes about reality itself, then we have to have major conflicts, and we have to have people killing each other, various models of reality. So it's one reason I wanted to invite attention to this problem, clashes of models of reality, and to reminding people about the reality tunnel, which keeps us from actually seeing very often the broader picture. In the big history, as we call it now, of the universe, the history of everything that exists, including mankind, is written in subatomic particles. The universe is absolutely filled with the stuff of life. There's even a galaxy that has a great deal of alcohol in it. And, so far the Irish haven't started pilgrimaging there, but it does have the same truth. And so when we talk about the history of mankind, we also have to realize that a star dies, explodes. It disseminates more of the stuff of life. You have one picture here of an exploding star with a fetus in the middle of it, because we're made up of all that stuff. We're intimately related, every star in the heavens, to every galaxy, to every comet, to every thing that exists in the universe. We're all intimately related with one another. And when we think about that and have a greater appreciation for our relationship with the universe and with our own Earth, to see the ecological crisis, we have two models of reality. There is a crisis and one that there isn't. One that we have global climate change and one that we don't. Now, there's very clashes about that. And yet we realize that life itself depends upon how we resolve this clash of models of reality. Because we're facing the destruction of the life support system. Don't think about ecology, but think of the life support system. Just like on the Enterprise, if somebody shoots us and our life support system goes down, then, Captain Kirk and all of us are dead meat. But our life support system is extremely pleased to say that the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, the actual head of the Orthodox Church, has realized in the last 5 years been very involved in this crisis accepting that there is a crisis and trying to give a position of leadership and try to solve them. But you see how deadly what reality can be. Some of my colleagues in the Protestant world say, well, we don't need to worry about the ecological crisis because we're all going to be raptured before it gets serious. For those of us who don't believe in the future, probably have a different model of reality about that. But in any case, the models of reality are at the root of so much of the strife in our civil society, in our culture, in our society in general, among religions and between religion and science, sometimes among scientists. You know, cosmic string theory is something of a heresy. So you see, it's not just a religious word. This is one thing I wanted to really bring out. But I also want to point out some things that really amaze me in their similarities. That is the connection between sex and death. We find that in the creation narrative somehow. I mean, that's not what the creation narrative really says. Some of the early church fathers and writers saw a connection between the two. And we know that there is a connection psychologically between the two, sex and death. It's tragic to say that the ultimate sexual fulfillment, the ultimate thrill, is killing somebody. Why you have that take place sometimes in connection with sexual relations. Extremely powerful passion which can destroy whole nations, can destroy people, can destroy societies and cultures, but it's not regulated, and when there's no control and discipline around it. Well, it's so that in procreation by sexual means, and now this is about 3.5 billion years ago, when a couple of haploid eukaryotes happened, exchange some genetic material, and then, you know, and then return to haploid having shared some genetic material. This is actually where sexual began, where sexual reproduction began. But when sexual reproduction began, death was inevitable. You see, the auto or free care cell is simply itself and divide. But something where it takes two of them because of the complexity of it, and it made possible to develop highly complex organisms, then they become inevitable because precisely now we're having sexual reproduction. So there is a definite connection, and somehow it's surprising to me how there was an innate knowledge or understanding of that in a way. And so there are several things that one can try. It puts aside hard theological models of reality a little bit and start to examine. And one thing that strikes one is that there's a surprising knowledge of things that have somehow passed down through us through the evolutionary process, which we still know somehow. So the idea of having these absolute hard fixed reality and not realizing that they're models and they're supposed to develop on those, and that when we have new knowledge and new understanding, we sometimes realize that the reality we've held are highly inappropriate and that they need to be changed and shifted. New knowledge and new understanding constantly. And this is one of the reasons I wanted to bring precisely this issue, that we might explore it a little bit and discuss it, you know, think about it, and think about our lack of knowledge and understanding.
I might ask you to slow down. I think we're losing some of your audio a little bit.
All right, through. But I want us to think together a little bit about how, with ignorance or lack of understanding or lack of knowledge, then make our models of reality or ideologies. And those ideologies are very difficult to change. Because when an ideology that's deeply held is challenged, human mind reverts back to its most primitive section and goes back to the self-preservation modes and activates the amygdala in very hyperactive ways. I've said for years that ultra-conservatism was a birth defect. And it turns out 3 major university studies agree with me, because and hardcore, as I like to call it, ideologies or models that have been turned into an ideology. And then a desire not to know anything that will have an impact on those models. And consequently, the most highly inappropriate models are as if they should be a divine law of some kind. For example, the persecution of women, which is tolerable. One woman is raped every 4 minutes in our world, and one woman is murdered every 4 hours. And we know that there are still societies and cultures where women are subject to extreme degradation, and usually on religious principles. And we understand too that within the Christian sphere, and perhaps the Semitic sphere in general, because many of the laws in the Old Testament are simply commonplace Semitic laws which have been systematized, commonplace Semitic tribal laws. The idea that woman was first in sin, she took a bite of the pomegranate. I don't think it was an apple, because actually getting the seeds out of a pomegranate could lead you into sin, but I'm not sure about the apple. But anyway, the idea that, see, the 2 trees in the Garden of Eden, I understand as being prophecies about the cross of Christ, not something concrete or real. Anyway, because the late addition to the creation narrative, which I think the rib story, came about after the return from Babylon, as I recall. And of course, it's a totally impossible story. The man couldn't have given any mitochondrial DNA to the woman if, she was taken from his rib, because it doesn't happen that way. In any case, because of that story, women have been brutalized and persecuted and degraded and humiliated and subject to all kinds of violations of their personhood. And in other societies, it was partly the clash between the fertility religions and the war god religions in it. And I think just before the great axial era, perhaps a bit before the time of Zarathustra, who was the grandfather of the first axial era, when tribal societies were collapsing and coming into organized community societies, and then building into kingdoms and empires, of course, warriors were much more highly valued than the women who planted and harvested and processed things. So it has something to do with it. But these became models of reality, that women are subhuman, or that women, have a lower status, or that women have, their personhood isn't as complete as male personhood. But of course, a female is the default gender. We have to think about that. Female is the default gender. And what happens, when a fetus is conceived, there have vestigial sex organs for both. Now, if it's an XY chromosome, that should be female, the female genitalia are simply going to blossom like a flower. They will look like a flower if you look at them up close. But if it's an XX chromosome is female, an XY chromosome, then the fallopian tubule, which contains the vestigial male genitalia, it becomes very complicated now to become a male. It has to generate an enzyme that shuts down the female mullarian tubule. Then it has to generate another enzyme that starts androgens working. Sometimes they complete the job, sometimes they don't. You have things like Klinefelter syndrome, where a person is basically 80% female, 20% male. And transgender people, this is a valid clinical situation. That's why gender harmonization surgery is covered by the Healthcare Act here. And also in Iran, I might add, gender harmonization surgery is paid for by the government. So, we have models of reality about these things that are absolute, hardcore concrete, but highly inappropriate and simply untrue in many cases. So these are things that we need to take into consideration as we have a real change, a demographic change. In the 21st century, the younger generation come along, and they don't buy into our prejudices and our malice and our hatred of my generation. And frankly, I really believe the younger generation are better than my generation. In so many ways, the younger generation that are taking over now, I have immense hope, because in my estimation, they're a great deal better than my generation. And they've looked into things more deeply, understood things more deeply. But the absolute foundation stone of all true morality, the absolute foundation stone, is empathy and fairness. And empathy and fairness are some things that my generation are very intolerant of. So empathy and fairness at the base of it. The only way I could describe evil, I mean, evil has no ontological being, it's not a thing. But evil is the absolute absence of empathy. And our Lord Jesus Christ commanded us, the basis of morality upon which all the law and the prophets hang, to love your neighbor as yourself, can only be fulfilled on the basis of empathy and a sense of fairness. Empathy is the only way you can possibly love your neighbor as yourself. And fairness. And our love for God, this is, for those who are believers, of course, become fairly natural. If we get rid of the fear mechanism that dominates religion so much, and realize that Christianity is not simply a hell avoidance tactic. It's not simply a hell avoidance technique. It has much more profound meaning than that. And yet, for most of our culture and society who are religious, it's merely a hell avoidance technique. So that's what I want to say about models of reality. And now I better shut up and let somebody see if we have any questions. But thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Archbishop. I think now, are you able to hear us okay?
I have a bit of that there. We got it.
Okay, so we will open it up to some questions or comments regarding your models of reality here. Is there anyone who would like to start us off? Yes, please, in the back.
I'm wondering how this fits in with the notion of certainty. The models seem to leave us with a sense of it's only good so far, and how certain can we be about things? Certainty excludes the opposite as being true. How does this work together with the notion of certainty?
Well, if we had absolute certainty, then Christians wouldn't be so divided themselves and Muslims wouldn't be killing each other. We'd have absolute certainty. We'd have something that was...
Mute the
Keep
microphone.
muting it.
Matthew, mute it, because that's when we can hear it.
if we had absolutes, then Christians wouldn't be fighting each other and arguing with each other all the time, and Muslims wouldn't be killing each other. We have absolutes, of course. From our point of view, God is absolute. The heavenly kingdom is absolute. But when we form what we think are absolutes, we have to realize that we have Christians right next to us. We're going to say, no, that's not right at all. I have the absolute, it's not you. I have the certainty, not you. So this is one of the things we do have to think about and become informed by the new knowledge that comes along. Well, one thing that is certain, society, civilization cannot exist without some kind of firm moral basis. And at the very cornerstone of our society and culture, as we know it, is really marriage and family. When we see that, of course, the big marriage and family is divorce, because you can practically get a mail order divorce. But I would like to say that if we have one certainty, is that our society and culture as we know it and that exists, that one thing is certain, that a stable system of marriage and family are necessary to the continuance of the society as we know it and want to defend it today. And that that's a certainty. I think most of the Ten Commandments, we would agree, give us some real certainties. You know, I have a different view of why they should be fulfilled, but you know, murder and theft and destroying ourselves with envy about our neighbors and slandering other people, you know, these things we can say with a great deal of certainty destroy and undermine communities, families, parish churches, universities. Any organization will be destroyed by those things, by doing those things that the Ten Commandments tell us not to do. I think that's a kind of certainty. But to speak absolutely, you know, the doctrine of the rapture, for example, which is some people's certainty and absolute, came into existence only in 1840s. Didn't exist anywhere in Christianity before that. So for some people, it's the most absolute certainty they know. We, our Roman Catholic brethren, our Anglican brethren, and many of our Protestant brothers and sisters wouldn't agree with that certainty at all, you see. So that the model of reality doesn't give us certainty. There are some certainties, but our models of reality generally don't give those to us.
Maybe I could ask you a question. There's been any number of differences between Western and Eastern Christianity. I was wondering if you would compare a little bit the two different views of Christianity's relationship with science. In other words, how does the Eastern Christian understanding of science differ or overlap with some of the Western Christian interpretations of science?
Well, I think, you know, from a theological point of view, he's not much regard for scholasticism. Things that came up like the blood atonement doctrine are not, you know, are considered desperately wrong in the East. Original sin, these things, we simply have no tradition of that at all. But one thing that scholasticism did in the West was it gave the foundation stone for scientific dialogue. You know, when you passed into nominalism and all these others, where you began to regard things in themselves instead of some abstract vision of things like some cosmos of Plato or something. And also, of course, the Gnostic and Platonistic dichotomy between body and soul is something we never accepted, which is probably why medicine advanced so much more rapidly in the East and so much more thoroughly, long before it developed in the West. On the other hand, you know, I've met some of the Vatican, what they call now Sons of Galileo, which somehow has been a bit iffy over the centuries, but the astronomers from the Vatican. And the development of science that was really nurtured by early Protestantism before it found out that there could be a clash. And all of this developed out of a scholastic mode of thinking. And in the East, we went so far as to develop astronomy, medical science, and things. But because of the invasions and the constant warfare, this kind of got shut down. You know, Anna Komnena, the daughter of Alexei Komnenos, was the last one to build a great major hospital in the East. She wrote the Alexiad, which was the first history written by a noted woman, but she also wrote a textbook in astronomy, and she wrote about medicine. And her grandmother wrote several books also. She wrote about astronomy. The hospital system in the East developed scientifically where it didn't in the West. And to the point where you even had a hospital-centered healthcare with standards of how often you should boil the sheets, how often the hospital should be cleaned, the medical research factory, which was built by John the Third, I guess, the father of Alexis. And throughout the whole history, modern hospitals were built in the East, whereas in the West they were really palliative units. But the other hard sciences began to develop more in the West because of scholasticism. But what scholasticism developed into, not what it began as. It was very Aristotelian in the beginning. And I think at Oxford in the 1600s you could be fined a shilling if you diverged by 1 point from Aristotle's rationalism in a paper that you submitted. But what it developed into, so in the idea of science and religion, the ironic thing is that the clash was more intense in the West than in the East. And perhaps it was because modern science grew out of the system of theologizing and then challenged much of the theology. And perhaps that's why the clash was greater. But, you know, in the West, we developed modern physics in a way. Borrowed a lot from Islam. Islam borrowed a lot from Byzantium in India. You know, mathematics was developed higher in India than it was anywhere else in the most ancient times. But the clash between the two developed in the West, partly because after the Reformation, which really was a disestablishment of Christianity in a way, a deconstruction, I should say, of Christianity. Not having the tradition, the Holy Fathers, well, and in the West, of course, the papacy and the things. The only thing left was the book. So the book became the absolute. Therefore, everything in the book became frozen into a model of reality. Therefore, when science disagreed with those models, it became a point of hysteria in the 1800s. And having sacred tradition going back, you know, all the centuries, and having some kind of something beyond the book, you could adapt more easily, more quickly and more profoundly. And that's why I think the Vatican has sponsored so much scientific endeavor. There's an adaptability there that on the surface it looks like it wouldn't, because the Vatican seems to be frozen in time. And yet there's been more of an adaptability there than there have been among other Christians, many other Christians, not all, but many. So in the East, all of these things simply, it didn't matter whether the earth moved around the sun or the sun moved around the earth. It simply didn't matter to anybody. Nobody cared to make any difference in our faith or what we believed. So you didn't have the clash in that regard. So, you know, one could go on, but I think that's enough. So.
Thank you. Yeah, one, yeah.
I'm going to move just a little closer so perhaps you can see. I want to ask a question about, it seems like it's part of your thesis that the conflicts reside in religion itself as an ideology or an adopting of a model of reality. And I want to press or challenge that supposition a little bit. You could say that today we live in a post-religious society, that we're really in a secular society now, not necessarily so much a religious or a Christian one, and yet it doesn't seem that we're any more peaceful as a world. So, you know, that would be one suggestion, or you know, someone else might suggest that, well, often wars are fought over religion, but often they're fought over other things, or often they're fought over religion when really there's something else at stake, like wealth or oil, right? So, I mean, what would you say about those kinds of suggestions?
You know, in the first place, the world's a great deal more peaceful than it used to be, and I think if one did a careful study of it and looked at the statistics, you'd find out that the world's a great deal more peaceful than it was a century ago or 2 centuries ago. And you'll find that in many sociological and studies, that in fact it is more peaceful. Now, it's not necessarily more peaceful because of differences between religion and science. It's more peaceful partly because we have, you know, when the Vietnam War came along and people could see on the telly what was going on, what actually was happening. You know, that's why we got a flood of immigrants here into Canada, because if it had been the Second World War, everybody would have known what it was about. The Second World War began in 1931. Most people think it began a little bit later. Actually, it began with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Everybody forgets about the Pacific War because, you know, we're all sort of Europhiles and Asiaphobes. But in any case, it began with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. The whole attitude of the Japanese Empire was something that wouldn't be feasible or possible today in the same way. So a lot of it has the fact that our greater communications have given us a greater empathy. And the intercommunication between people, you know, when the Tahrir Square uprising started, it had been planned for several years. And it had involved Serbian students who had very peacefully overthrown the Milosevic government in Serbia. And Serbian students were back and forth between Egypt, and some Egyptian young people had gone to Serbia, and they were studying this Serbian technique of how they overthrew the government in a completely peaceful manner. And one of the great moments for the younger generation, I think, was in Tahrir Square, when they policed themselves and kept themselves from erupting into violence. And that took enormous self-control, enormous discipline. But the fact that we've been able to do those things in the previous centuries, we didn't. Now, the secularization that's taking place is partly a product of liberal democracy, and I don't know any of you sitting there who would want to do away with liberal democracy. But democracy is a kind of infeudation. You know, the feudal system developed, and you had the lords and nobles who had all the powers and rights. But by infeudation, that went to the middle class, who really held up and supported society, the whole society. And then, of course, the House of Commons became dominant over the House of Lords. And now the House of Lords is really rather insignificant in the overall picture of things. But the fact is that religion has a great deal of power and structure, gives a great deal of power and structure in society that I think, personally, now this is my model of reality, I think it's absolutely necessary, and I think it has still a great deal to offer and a great deal to give. And if we can stop fighting each other and come to some actual conclusion about what our moral system actually consists in, and put the Old Testament behind us in that regard, with all due respect to Jews and Muslims, because I don't think a man should be able to sell his daughter into slavery. I don't think a man should be able to beat his slave almost to death, but not quite to death. I really don't think we should be able to stone unruly teenagers to death. I don't think we should have corporal punishment at all for teenagers, see. And we, of course, in Canada, we absolutely do not believe in the death penalty. We don't have one. And we won't even extradite somebody to a jurisdiction that is going to inflict or could inflict a death penalty. So you see, we have different systems. It's grossly immoral to have a death penalty. From our model of reality, it's anti-religious to have a death penalty. It's anti-Christian to have a death penalty. These things are. It's anti-Christian to humiliate and degrade other members of our society and our culture, women in particular, and so many things that some Christians think are absolutely necessary to Christianity, we would see them as being anti-Christian. And so we have to really ask Christians, iron out, how are we going to respond to secularism? Well, one reason secularism is on the increase is because so many of us demand that people must believe things that they know are absolutely untrue in order to be Christians. Consequently, we're giving the game to secularists that way. So we're going to have to come to grips with those things which we think are absolutely necessary to be believed. Not all of us, of course. You know, there's absolutely no monolith in Christianity. There's no single belief in Christianity. Some Christians don't believe in the resurrection. Some Christians don't believe that Christ was actually God. You know, things which for us are absolutes in our religion. Things which, the resurrection of the dead, for example. We have Christians who believe it's only spiritual, that the body is not going to be resurrected. For us, the resurrection of the dead is an absolute. We believe that. Is absolutely intrinsic in our faith. You know, marriage and family, for example, the crowning of the marriage and church, by crowning with the grace of the Holy Spirit. For us, this is a concrete part of our reality, of our belief. And I know they are of our Roman Catholic brethren as well. But there's a divergence of view and opinion and understanding of these things among many Christians. So when we're talking about religion versus secularism, well, okay, we have to first of all define what are we talking about in this clash. Personally, I think government should be secular. I wouldn't want an Islamic government imposing Sharia law me or anybody I know. And I wouldn't want a Christian form of Sharia either, because it might not be what we Orthodox Christians believe. It might be what some kind of radical Calvinist believe. Remember, apartheid was a Christian religious doctrine. And because the religion had so much power in the state, apartheid became civil law. But apartheid was a Calvinist Arminian doctrine. And this is what my issue is here. When we're back in a secular society, we cannot do it by insisting that people must believe something that they know is absolutely not true, and then think that we're going to win the battle against secularism. We have to come together as Christians and iron out precisely what it is we're defending and what it is we're presenting. See? When I get up on the stage with people from 6 different denominations of Christian, and somebody asks us a question, they might get 6 different answers, or at least 4 different answers that absolutely clash with the answers that we and say the Roman Catholics and some other Southern Baptists might give. You know, we're talking about this in regards to abortion. So we would stand together, but then other Christians would say, no, 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 we're Christians too, and we don't believe that. So this is one of the problems we have, you see. We Christians have different models of reality that clash not only with science, but sometimes very, very radical, and sometimes very fanatic with each other, you know. I mean, the Pope of Rome is not Antichrist. 666 doesn't mean, you know, the Pope of Rome. I was on a radio station once called the Tower of Power, so you can imagine. And I was there with the Roman Catholic priesthood, and they didn't know enough about Orthodoxy or Canada, you know, to ask any significant questions. But they told him, what do the people in your church call you? And he said, well, they call me Father. They call you Father? It does in the Bible, don't call any man on earth Father. Of course, it also says, don't call any man your teacher or your leader or your master. See? So schools are leading our students into sin because they make us call somebody teacher. Well, he was silent for a moment, and then one of the people said, we have to return to the faith of our founding fathers. And the Catholic priest said, the faith of your what? The founding fathers. Oh, I see. But you're not supposed to call them fathers. Didn't you just say that? So you see, these kind of, you know, when I lectured at universities, I've asked students, sometimes I lecture in a combined physics philosophy class, but since I go under full sail, that religion comes up. And I'll ask, how many of you were raised in a Christian family? Now, before the 1990s, people born in the 1990s, it would sometimes be as many as 90–95%. And then I would ask, how many of you still consider yourself to be Christians? Maybe 4 or 5%. After the 90s, it's more like 50% were raised in Christian families, you know. But then I started asking why. Hypocrisy and bigotry rank very high in the reasons they reject Christianity. And Mohandas Gandhi said, and I agree with Mohandas Gandhi, the biggest problem with Christians is they pay so little attention to Jesus Christ. You see, and this is an issue. We Christians, are we going to stand against secularism? Well, we better get our act together, and we better slow up on the fanaticism and the harshness and the brutality. That's otherwise we might. I believe that Jesus Christ is my Savior, my Redeemer, and that through Him I can enter into the heavenly kingdom. But I'm not going to be able to convince anybody else of that. Sure, by telling them, so, 2 centuries ago, who was a very sweet, good mother and did all kinds of good stuff in her little isolated village. Because she didn't know Jesus Christ, she's going to burn forever in hell because God hates her. I mean, how far am I going to get with something like that by arguing with the secularists? You see? We need to get our act together and talk to each other more, we Christians, and try to iron out, you know, what we actually believe. You know, what essentials of what we believe. And do we really need to be brutalizing and psychologically bullying or emotionally bullying other human beings? And do we really need to base our religion on fear instead of love? Because that's precisely what we've been doing. And yet, God, whoever has fear has not yet learned how to love perfectly. Because love, and Paul said we have not been given over in bondage to a spirit of fear, and yet we base 90% of our religion is based on the fear of hell, not the love of God. So, you know, we've got to get our act together, you know, really, about it. So that's all I can say about the clash of secularists, you know. Anybody else?
Well, let me ask one final question, and then I think we'll wrap it up. But very often we read religious and sacred texts to teach us about religious truth. What does science, the learning how to read about light and blood and rocks, teach us about religious truth?
Well, you know, I mean, I have to speak, you know, from an Eastern perspective now, because that's what I have. But the more, you know, I studied, of course, particle physics, went into quantum later, and I studied in my 4th year of neurobiology right now, as a matter of fact. The more you know, I have 3 neurobiologists or neuroscientists who come here to the monastery for liturgy. One of them has done her doctorate and done some very good work. And she said, I realized that by studying DNA and studying the neural system, I'm reading the alphabet of God. I'm reading the language of God. And for me, the more I've gone into the quantum aspect of physics, the deeper my faith in God has become. The more light shed on my perspective and understanding about God. And for me, it's enriched my faith. And actually, I know a number of cosmologists. I don't know one of them who's an actual atheist, you see. One specialized tend to be sometimes. But the fact is, most cosmologists will say that, well, there's being in the universe. You know, they don't just say God, because that's not scientific. Being might not be either. But anyway, that we at least, Minas Kapatos, I think in one of his books said, we now have reason, we have solid reason for saying that there's being in the universe. In other words, possibility of God. And for me, that my conviction of that becomes stronger the more I delve into quantum science. And that's, so I think everybody could find a similar experience, even in evolution. The things that I see in evolution, by not getting hysterical and panicked about it, but by stepping back and paying attention, really make me realize that the psychology taught in the Old Testament, and some of the innate understandings of humanity are really verified to me in evolution. And consequently, for me, from my point of view now, from my model of reality, I don't want to go beyond that, to say, make any other claims. Evolution is something that happens because that's the way life is programmed to happen, and that's the way it happens, from my point of view, by God's will, the eternal will. So that's just my take on it. But that's my model of reality. I wouldn't suggest everybody has to accept that.
Good. Well, I want to thank you very much for this. And thank you all for coming. Thank you so much, Archbishop.